Hi, my name is Rachel Greenberg, and today I'll be discussing studying safe and effective dosing of drugs in neonates and infants, experience of the Pediatric Trials Network. In terms of disclosures, I provide consulting services for several companies, none of which are related to the content of this presentation. And my presentation will involve discussion of off-label use of some drugs approved by the FDA for other indications or populations. So today I'm going to start with the FDA label. We know that the FDA label is a guide for clinicians. It's supposed to tell the right dose, the right indication for which a drug is supposed to be used, and the population that it's supposed to be used in. It's a mechanism for safety and efficacy that the public relies on to keep them safe in terms of the medications that are being prescribed. But we do know that especially in children, often the FDA label does not accurately reflect what is actually being done in clinical practice. For example, in the neonatal ICU, which is where I work clinically as a neonatologist, this is a really common practice. So we did a study that was published back at the beginning of 2022 in the Journal of Pediatrics, where we looked across several hundred different NICUs across the United States. And we looked at the medications that were prescribed to infants hospitalized in the NICU. We ranked them in order of exposure. And then we looked at the FDA labels to see whether they were FDA approved in the population for which they were being prescribed. So when we looked at the population of infants at the highest risk or extremely low birth weight infants, those born less than 1,000 grams birth weight, we saw that 10 out of the 20 top prescribed drugs were not FDA approved at all for this population. Many of them obviously are being used off-label. So they're being used for a different indication, for a different age range, for a different dose, and therefore we're using these drugs in infants off the FDA label. And these are really common drugs. We're talking drugs that are most commonly prescribed in the NICU: furosemide, dopamine. Pretty much any pain medication is not FDA approved. So why aren't these drugs FDA approved? Well, it's because there hasn't been enough trials done, or the trials have been done, but the data haven't been submitted to the FDA, or they're not sufficient. They don't have sufficient data. And why are they challenging to do? Most of the time, the trials haven't been done. And that's because, number one, they're expensive. Any trial in infants is going to need long-term follow-up to make sure that the particular medication is safe or has expected effects long-term. And that is quite expensive. These trials often are difficult in terms of feasibility. Not only is the population literally small, but there is a small number of available infants that participate in trials compared to, say, the number of adults available to participate in cardiovascular trials. A lot of clinicians will also suggest that there's a lack of equipoise for participation in trials because they're used to following the practice that they've been practicing for potentially years, even if that practice is not completely evidence-based and supported by the FDA label. In addition, there's also a lack of understanding of disease natural history. So there's a lot of groundwork needed even prior to beginning to design a trial to understand outcomes and sample size. Otherwise, it's not even worth embarking on a trial. In addition, biomarker qualification and development of surrogate endpoints are steps that are crucially needed to be able to design efficient trials in children. And often we don't have those available. We don't have validated endpoints. And there are some drugs for which there is actually no adult indication And it's very difficult to extrapolate down to to even guess at what dosing for in infants should be. So to try to address some of these issues, the Pediatric Trials Network has been created. It was funded initially in 2010 and was developed to create an infrastructure for investigators to conduct trials that improve pediatric labeling and child health. The PTN is sponsored by NICHD through the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, and the success is defined by improving dosing and safety information, labeling, and ultimately child health. The PTN is really focused on the off-patent therapeutic space. So drugs that have been approved, there's no other group that's really incentivized to study these in terms of industry because these drugs are off-patent. In terms of types of studies that PTN performs, we really often concentrate on phase 1 and phase 2 studies, so PK and safety generally, and we have substantial interaction with FDA. So we submit our protocol designs to FDA prior to performing the study and perform the study under IND. And after the studies are done, we submit the data to FDA for consideration for potential label change. And here is our latest infographic showing the different successes that we've had. We've enrolled over 11,000 participants and submitted those data to FDA at least 26 times. We're enrolling in over 200 sites across the country and some foreign sites as well. We've studied, importantly, many different therapeutic areas. So we call ourselves therapeutic area agnostic, in that we're not just interested in studying drugs within cardiology or pulmonology or critical care or neurology. We've done studies in all of those. So if a particular drug is in need of study, we are happy to do it. Because of the different studies we've done and the data that we submitted to the FDA, this has led to label changes in the FDA labels. And so we're very excited to have contributed to 17 of those. We also disseminate our work through publications. And we've developed quite a few methods as well in this process. So these are the number of molecules that we've actually studied in blood or are about to study and develop methods for determining drug concentrations. We've looked at both plasma and dried blood spots. And then we've importantly looked at other matrices as well, including breast milk, cerebrospinal fluid, and urine. PTN has contributed to pediatric drug development through the use of specialized techniques that allow drugs to be studied efficiently in children. These include the use of advanced pharmacokinetics modeling methods that require fewer samples from each participant, which decreases risk to participants and increases the ability to enroll. In particular, this is important for infants. Also important are the focus on blood sampling methods, where we worked with labs that developed ultra low volume sampling methods, including the development of dried blood spot methods, which allow different, more efficient processing and less blood to be used. We've also used leftover samples in the lab to determine blood concentrations from those. Study design is also incredibly important when it comes to enrolling in pediatric trials. In several PTN trials, we've used a dose escalating approach where an initial cohort is enrolled at a lower dose, and then following review by a data safety monitoring board, the dose is then increased in the next cohorts. Master protocols are an area where PTN has been able to efficiently enroll the largest number of participants. Our largest master protocol, the POP study, or the Pediatric Opportunistic PK study, is flexible enough to cover multiple drugs that are prescribed to children by standard care. And then enrollment in the study allows the collection of PK samples and then that valuable data. PTN has also implemented master protocols to study drugs transferred via breast milk and anesthetics and analgesics, which is an area that's deeply understudied, particularly in infants. We've also incorporated the use of real-world data, both in study design and in order to extend the findings of similar studies, of smaller studies. As I've mentioned, one of the major missions of the PTN includes working with FDA under the BPCA program to perform studies that inform label changes. So here's a list of all the label changes that have been done under this program. One of the most recent ones that we've accomplished back in the last year, 2021, was the clindamycin label change. So we used data from 4 different PTN studies, which contributed to revision of this label. And the label was updated to include dosing recommendations for infants with infections. These data are important because the studies found that the doses necessary to achieve therapeutic exposures for premature infants were larger as the infants became older. And you can see that in the dosing chart there. In terms of what's coming up next for PTN, we've recently completed several studies, the data of which are being submitted to FDA, and I'll review a few of them that are concerning infants. One is the safety of furosemide in preterm infants at risk of bronchopulmonary dysplasia study. This was a randomized controlled trial to address bronchopulmonary dysplasia, which is the most common pulmonary morbidity of prematurity. And our objective was to evaluate the safety and preliminary efficacy of furosemide in preterm infants at risk of developing BPD. We performed this randomized controlled trial in 80 premature infants, less than 29 weeks gestational age, who were at high risk for developing BPD. And we've completed the initial data analysis and are currently in negotiation with the FDA for a potential label change. Another study recently completed is the pharmacokinetics and safety profile of digoxin in infants with single ventricle congenital heart disease study. We know that congenital heart disease is a particular problem that affects a certain number of children and is very serious and fatal without intervention, particularly surgical intervention early in life. But there are no drugs that are currently labeled to reduce mortality between the initial stages of surgery. So we studied and fully enrolled 50 infants less than 6 months of age with single ventricle congenital heart disease who were between their stage 1 and stage 2 surgeries. We are fully enrolled, as I mentioned, and awaiting completion of data analysis and submission of those data to FDA. We also have another study ongoing that involves infants. This is the Cuddle Study, or the pharmacokinetics and safety of commonly used drugs in lactating women and breastfed infants. So this is one of those opportunistic master protocols that I mentioned, where we measure drug concentrations in breast milk and maternal and infant plasma. And we are enrolling 50 lactating women and their breastfed infants per each drug of interest. The study involves collection of biological samples, and the schema is that the medication is taken by mom, and then we get samples of that breast milk, mom's blood, and the infant's blood at an inpatient or outpatient study visit. One of the first drugs that we have data in is oxycodone. So what we found for that drug is that an infant who received a standard amount of milk per day from a mother who was receiving a standard dose of oxycodone would receive a much smaller fraction of that oxycodone. So relative to a maternal dose of that is standard, the relative infant dose was quite low. And even though oxycodone and its metabolites are concentrated in breast milk, we found that oxycodone that was administered at doses less than 60 milligrams per day is unlikely to result in clinically relevant exposures in infants. And this is really important because there are many drugs that are not labeled for breastfeeding and don't have information related to the amount of exposure for the infants. And oxycodone was a really commonly used drug in that category. So we were able to submit this data to FDA. It's under consideration for label change now. And what we hope is that the label will then include the proportion of oxycodone dosing transferred into the breast milk and the infant's plasma exposure to help guide clinicians who are treating moms. For the Cuddle study, we've enrolled the 9 drugs that you see listed there, and we're enrolling in the next set of drugs now. As I mentioned, we've submitted the data for oxycodone to FDA, and ondansetron has also been submitted. We will soon be submitting nifedipine and sertraline. So that was a quick update on everything that's going on with the Pediatric Trials Network. As you saw on that previous slide, we have some other upcoming studies and startup phases as well. So I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much.